It'll be kicked off momentarily by Joe Holland, followed by a number of panel presentations, papers, and workshops after lunch. So I think we're in for a treat today and a lot of interesting insight. Before we begin and before I introduce Joe, I want to say a little bit about the program. So there's going to be a coffee break immediately following Joe's talk. It will be straight down the hallway you came in the classroom building lobby. So please make sure that you use that time for restroom breaks and such too. Then we'll come back here 10 a.m. Paul Misner, Claire Adams, and David Lutz. You can tell from the titles of the three papers that those are all foundational topics and discussions of things that came before Sea Judge Act. So we'll get a little Western European history there. And following that, we'll do another coffee break and come back for another session. And with that being said, let me introduce everyone to Dr. Joe Holland. And Joe is an ego-philosopher and Catholic theologian who completed his PhD from the University of Chicago, as I think some of other people in the room have as well. And Joe's PhD was in the field of ethics and society, and that had a component where it was structured as an interdisciplinary dialogue of theology with philosophy and social science. At Chicago, he studied theology with David Tracy, philosophy with Paul Ricoeur, and social science with Gibson Winter. He was a Fulbright Scholar in philosophy at the Universidad Católica in Santiago, Chile, and he also serves as Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Religion at St. Thomas University in Miami Gardens, Florida. He's also an active adjunct professor in the School of Law at St. Thomas University, and he's permanent visiting professor at the Universidad Nacional del Altiplano in Puno, Peru. He's president of Pax Romana and Catholic Movement for Intellectual and Cultural Affairs USA, and he's also the editor of Pachamateris Press, which many of you saw the flyers at the book stand as well as my book. So let's give a warm welcome to Joe Holland. And
Pace e bene, peace and goodness to each and every one of you. Also special thanks to Bob Pennington and Stephen Bignaz, who cannot be with us, unfortunately, for organizing this important meeting. It's a great sadness that we've all learned the passing of his wife. He's a very special man who has done such extensive and extraordinary work in regard to Cardine, and really lament that he can't be with us. And greetings to all my sisters and brothers from Pax Romana here, the Pax Romana movement, and also to many old friends and colleagues who's delight to see, and particularly an expression of gratitude to Orlando Errasa and Ana Grande, who were respectively the nephew and niece of the wonderful martyr Utilio Grande. It's a deep honor to have both of you here. In this presentation, I will try to use the See Judge Act method for the sermon in the present historical moment, but at the macro global level of civilization and in relation to Catholic social teaching. I will then end with a few comments about implications of this discernment for the contemporary Catholic University. In this presentation on the larger context of civilization, I'm drawing on the use of the See Judge Act method by the Latin American Church, including its emphasis on social analysis of the contextual reality and its still developing theology of liberation and ecology, which we see reflected in the recent encyclical letter of our beloved Pope Francis. Before entering into the topic, however, please allow me to recommend the important new book written by our host, Bob Pennington. It's titled Catholic Practical Theology, a genealogy of the methodological terms of praxis, historical reality, and the preferential option for the poor. It's an extraordinary work, and well worth going through. And Bob, I think, has written a definitive work on the historical background of the evolution of this method and its canonization. also, in this talk, I will draw on another book of my own published last year called Postmodern Ecological Spirituality, which may have the longest subtitle ever written. It is Catholic Christian Hope for the Dawn of a Postmodern Ecological Civilization, Rising from Within the Spiritual Dark Night of Modern Industrial Civilization. That book is the source, a longer, much longer source of my remarks here. Before entering into the presentation, however, I thought we might take a moment to pray one of the two prayers that Pope Francis gave us at the end of his encyclical letter of this. It's called the Prayer for Our Earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out your love upon pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes, bringing healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey upon it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who only look for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace, and ecology. First part of the talk is one time I went to, I have three parts in this C. Judge Act. I went to it when I was a young theology student. Some friends of mine, one was much older than I was, but he got us tickets to, during the Second Vatican Council, a big ecumenical conference that was being held at Boston College. He wrote, he said we were important theologians, all this, so we stuck in it. And they truly took Hans Kung, everybody was there, everybody was anybody. It was incredible. And they had, of course, asked the Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, seated moment, who had a real rough voice. So I saw him as he was coming in to deliver his talk, and some young priest hands him a big stack of paper. I guess that was his talk. I'm sure he'd never seen it before. And he puts it down and he looks at it and he says, I've divided my talk into 3 parts to make it more interesting. And he read very beautifully. And I remember Jean Danielou, he was up in front, he was asleep, drooling there. Everybody was asleep. Finally, after an hour and 15 minutes, he stopped. And he looked up and he said, Part 2. So I promise it will not be that way. The method's C phase. Laudato Si at the end of the modern world. And the title of this talk is the C. Judge Act method. Laudato Si, and at the end of the modern world, see him, and its implications for the Catholic University. Yesterday and today, in a parallel meeting with our own meeting here, the Vatican's new dicastery for promoting integral human development, led by Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana, is hosting a very important event. It is the International Conference on the 3rd anniversary of Pope Francis's magnificent 2015 encyclical letter on ecology, Laudato Si. The conference is titled, Saving Our Common Home and the Future of Life on Earth. Cardinal Turkson kindly invited me to this important Vatican conference. I wrote back, however, that I had already agreed to be here today. But I also told him that I would use this important occasion to promote Laudato Si. I propose that Laudato Si now stands as a central papal document for what I call the new global and authentically postmodern stage of Catholic social teaching, which has been developing since the papacy of St. John the 23rd, elected in 1958. I further propose that Pope Francis Laudato Si holds for postmodern Catholic social teaching the same central place that Leo XIII's 1891 encyclical letter Rerum Novarum held for modern Catholic social teaching. In 1950, the late great Italian-German Catholic philosopher Romano Guardini published his prophetic book, Das Ende der Neuzeit, translated as The End of the Modern World. In rounded centuries, the modern world may be understood as running from 1500 to 2000, an historical cycle of approximately 500 years. In that great book, Guardini argued that the modern world was grounded in an erroneous philosophical understanding of scientific technological power, which he now saw as devastating nature, and at the same time, turning nature against humanity. Implicitly, Guardini argued, the modern world was no longer sustainable, and therefore was coming to its end. In that same year of 1950, Archbishop Angelo Roncalli, then papal nuncio to France, welcomed Guardini to his office in Paris. Together they dialogued for 3 hours. After that meeting, Guardini reported that he was deeply moved by Roncalli's intellectual depth. In the following decade, our human family and our guardian planet Earth were confronted with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In that global crisis, the two global superpowers, representing respectively the liberal capitalist and the scientific socialist ideologies of modern industrial civilization, threatened to destroy much of life on planet Earth. Seeing the Cuban Missile Crisis as a world historical turning point, Roncalli, now as John XXIII, published his landmark 1963 encyclical letter, Pacem in Terris. In it, he identified the, quote, present shape and structure of political life in the modern world, unquote, as, quote, unequal to the task of promoting the common good of all peoples. In turn, John called for what Pope Pius XII had earlier named a new moral order. And then he advanced that call by urging support and creation for a truly global public authority with power, organization, and means coextensive with these problems and with a worldwide sphere of influence. And he saw the United Nations as a step in that direction. As Guardini's 1950 book had announced the end of the modern world, John, in his 1963 encyclical, was implicitly pointing out the need for a new global civilization that would be what I describe as authentically postmodern. In the words of the subtitle of Pacem in Terris, the task of this new civilization would be to establish universal peace in truth, justice, love, and liberty. In the late 19th century, Pope Leo XIII, in launching modern Catholic social teaching, had laid out a strategy for reforming modern industrial civilization on its liberal capitalist side, and at the same time, for resisting its scientific social side, which was atheistic. Almost a century later, John, in Pacem in Terris, and in his earlier prophetic encyclical, Mater Magistrum, launched postmodern Catholic social teaching. In doing so, he invited humans from both modern ideologies to create a post-ideological global civilization that would be implicitly ecological. It may sound strange to propose that John implicitly called for an ecological civilization, but if one reads Mater Magistra deeply, which updated Leo's Rerum Novarum on its 70th anniversary, and the Vatican usually wants to forget about it until Francis wants to forget about those reasons. It becomes clear that John called for a new development model that would break beyond the modern bourgeois vision of industrializing and urbanizing the entire world. The word bourgeois, of course, means urban. In part 3 of Mater Magistra, John called for a balanced economy to protect and sustain rural families, rural farms, and rural communities. As the child of a poor rural farming family himself, John believed that society needed to remain grounded in nature, and especially through its rural family farms and rural farming communities. Indeed, we might say that John, without using the name, was an early prophet of what is today called agroecology. For that reason, I describe St. John XXIII as the prophetic founder of modern Catholic teaching. His strategy builds on, yet also goes beyond, Leo XIII's prophetic strategy of modern Catholic social teaching. In addition, John's new strategy has been further developed by Pope Paul VI, St. John Paul II, and Pope Benedict XVI. Finally, since Francis Laudato Si, the postmodern Johannine strategy of Catholic social teaching needs to be explicitly understood as integrally ecological. That means, in the words of the title of a seminal book by Leonardo Boff, the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth are inextricably linked. In Laudato Si, Francis fuses natural ecology and social ecology into integral ecology. At the same time, he calls for ecological spirituality, which I would also call spiritual ecology. In this larger sense, we may understand integral ecology more fully as the interwoven fabric and creative communion of natural, social, and spiritual life across our garden planet Earth. In Laudato Si, Francis also tells us that we are now leaving to future generations a vast devastation of our loving Creator's beloved and continuing creation of our garden planet Earth. His warnings are confirmed by prophetic voices in the earth sciences, which state that we have already entered a new and dangerous period of Earth history that is radically altering the biological, chemical, and geological structure of Earth itself. They call that devastation the advent of the Anthropocene epoch, ending the earlier Holocene epoch, which goes back to the origin of agriculture after the last ice age, approximately 11,000 years ago. In an even more radical diagnosis, the late Catholic ecological prophet Thomas Berry told us that we are now terminating the still longer Cenozoic era, which was the 67 million year period of Earth history in which life and beauty flourished as never before in Earth history. In turn, Thomas Berry called for creation of what he named a new Ecozoic era, in which humanity and the rest of nature would be defined in what he called a mutually enhancing manner, and in which humanity would be guided by a new and functionally ecological cosmology. In the remainder of this presentation, since the time is short, and Stefan said only 20 minutes, but Bob said a few more, I will, in more abbreviated form, address the judge and act phases of the method in relation to our present global breakdown of integral ecology. After that, I'll offer a few concluding remarks as noted about the Catholic University. On the method's judge phase, part 2. Foundational spirituality in nature. At the end of the 500-year cycle of what Guardini called the modern world, we need to recover our human family's primal awareness of being rooted in Mother Nature as the foundational source of spiritual life. Nature as the foundational source of spiritual life. That's why the more urban we become, the more spirituality disappears. This is what Thomas Berry called the first revelation, or the primary revelation. It is also what ancient Christian theologians called the spiritual revelation of the book of nature. Nature is thus the spiritual ground for reading the later book of the Bible as the second revelation. Thus, the Creator has given us two books of revelation, the book of nature and the book of the Bible. The Protestant Reformation rejected the book of the Bible, the book of nature, as a source of revelation, but they did so because that had already grown up, that false consciousness had already grown up within late medieval Catholicism. We have to remember Protestantism was a Catholic invention. All priests, mostly, Yet the historical trajectory of Western civilization has, in the classical and modern periods, pointed away from nature and later against nature. Classical Western aristocratic elites first constructed a hierarchical, patriarchal form of civilization that elevated elite male humans above our human families' natural spiritual roots in the webs and cycles of nature, which indigenous people, traditional peasantry, and women had spiritually celebrated. Next, modern Western bourgeois elites constructed a new urban industrial civilization that completely rejected our family's roots in nature. Like a deformed and misguided male warrior, it has waged scientific technological war against nature. It has attempted to conquer and to exploit nature, and also to conquer and exploit supposedly inferior humans who still identify with nature. Today, we represent the last generations of that vast, first Western and now globalized devastation of the integral ecology of our garden planet Earth. Again, that this devastation is at once natural, social, and spiritual. For that reason, all modern bourgeois institutions, economic, political, intellectual, and religious, have now become cosmologically dysfunctional. That is because they remain grounded in the dysfunctional modern bourgeois cosmology, which has blinded itself to the foundational spirituality of nature and turned against nature itself. To reverse that degenerative process of integral ecological devastation, ecological spirituality needs to become foundational. I believe that nothing less than a global eco-spiritual renaissance of all the flowing rivers of our human family's spiritual energy will be sufficient to stop the late modern techno-scientific devastation of natural, social, and spiritual life. Such global spiritual energy of integral ecological regeneration, and especially as coming from indigenous people and women, needs to become the regenerative ground for an authentically postmodern ethics of integral ecology. The method's ACT phase toward a postmodern ecological civilization. This is very brief and it's elaborate on my talk. For the ACT phase of the CJUD method, in discerning at the macro global level of civilization, I would like to recommend three sequential yet overlapping steps. First, a global eco-spiritual renaissance, as mentioned above, including its Catholic Christian form, but in dialogue with all world Christian spiritual traditions. Two, a new lay eco-monasticism centered in rural and regenerative eco-villages, including women and men, married and singles, and children, and following the Celtic Christian model of monasticism, which was that of eco-villages. Christian Celtic monasticism was not leaving the world, it was gathering people in the villages of regeneration. But it was suppressed, very unfortunately, by the late Latin Benedictine model in partnership with the papacy in favor of Romanization. And third, planting regenerative institutional seeds for a locally rooted but globally networked postmodern ecological civilization. Nothing short of a new civilization will be adequate. So much more could be said about each of these three steps, but there is not sufficient time, even with a longer framework for this presentation. And again, my earlier book, Postmodern Ecological Civilization, explores all three of the subjects. Implications for the Catholic University. Finally, many concerned individuals wonder why such broad and extensive ecological movements on the earth are nonetheless unsuccessful. Paris Accords, we've gone backwards. Despite growing awareness of deep ecological problems, each day the global ecological crisis grows worse. One central reason is that practically all the disciplines within the modern Western university system, now globalized, and including Catholic universities, remain grounded in the dysfunctional intellectual logic of what has been called the modern Cartesian Newtonian cosmology. And I could say more about that. I didn't build it in because I didn't. That cosmology stands philosophically at the intellectual root of the modern global devastation of integral ecology. And yet this is the intellectual foundation of the university system. Each semester, endless numbers of students across our garden planet Earth are studiously trained through practically all the university's disciplines in the dysfunctional logic of the modern Cartesian Newtonian cosmology. That vast intellectual inertia of dysfunctional logic is then carried over into all modern societal institutions by endless waves of graduating students. Leo XIII, in launching his strategy of modern Catholic social teaching, had wisely understood that unless the bourgeois philosophical ground of modern industrial civilization was transformed, all his proposed social reforms would be in vain. Without philosophical reform, modern industrial civilization would only go deeper into crisis, which is what is now happening and in its terminal phase. For that reason, Leo had ordered every Catholic school of higher education in the world to teach the revived Neo-Aristotelian philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. But Neo-Thomism never succeeded in transforming the mainstream of Western philosophy, as Leo had hoped. The reason is that modern Western philosophy was grounded in the still widely accepted modern Cartesian Newtonian cosmology, which we now know is ecologically dysfunctional. But see, Neo-Thomism remained grounded cosmologically in the pre-Copernican Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology, which had been thoroughly discredited by science, and especially by Newton. Newton had unified the supposedly hierarchical spirit-matter dualism of celestial mechanics and terrestrial mechanics into the single mechanical system of Epicurean atomism. Yet Catholic Neo-Thomist philosophy could not accept the modern Cartesian Newtonian cosmology because it was a retrieval of the classical Greek philosopher Epicurus' anti-religious materialism. It should not be a surprise that we produced a materialist society. That's the intellectual foundation for it, and that's what the university teaches. Today, however, it is the modern Cartesian Newtonian cosmology that is itself being scientifically discredited. Hence, the field is open for creating intellectually a new and authentically postmodern stage, at least in the Catholic universities, of the Aristotelian Thomist tradition, grounded in what Thomas Berry, the great Catholic theologian and what he called himself, a geologian, grounded in what Thomas Berry called the new story of a holistically and co-creatively evolutionary cosmos. To create that new cosmological ground and to redefine all university disciplines in support of integral ecology is the great intellectual challenge facing the postmodern university, and especially the postmodern Catholic university. Until that happens, however, the great global ecological crisis will intensify. The rise of reactionary restorationist politics and religion will also intensify. And the new evangelization will continue to collapse across the advanced industrial countries, of Western civilization. Most importantly, young people will find themselves intellectually betrayed by the same universities, both secular and Catholic, that only train them to succeed in living and working within the ecological dysfunctionality of most late modern institutions. Thank you.
So at this time, we want to encourage questions for Joe. That was a wonderful paper, very thought-provoking, lots of ideas, questions. So at this time, if you just want to raise your hand, you can ask your question, and Joe will field it. Yes.
see the path forward in this. Where is the example that we want to follow of the right way to do this?
Okay. But there's a bunch of questions there. The physics, the farm, Trump. I want to say this, Newton was not a Newtonian. First of all, he thought that gravity was the hand of God moving everything. So he did think the divine was present in the universe. Secondly, the corpus of his religious writings are far larger than the corpus of his spiritual, of his scientific writings. But that never gets told. The alternative to having the dualism of what we had with the Cartesian cosmology, Descartes created a shriveled form of the Platonic psyche or soul, which couldn't survive, and thought if we combine that with, not so much with Newton, it was before Newton, but with Epicurean materialism of atomism, but that it would not hold, and the atomism, the materialism overwhelms the shriveled soul of Descartes. And Christianity had organized around this shriveled soul. We still speak of saving souls and going to heaven, and you know the cura animorum, in the cure of souls. The cura, the priest was called in Spanish, the cure in French, and similar. The curate in English. That you're only supposed to take care of the soul, not the body. And so you save souls and you go to heaven. If you talk to Jesus about that, he wouldn't have known what in the world you were talking about. It's straight out of Plato. Straight out of Plato. I won't get into in his Republic. It comes right out of there. Jesus talked about the transformation of the heavens and the earth together, an eschatological renewal of all creation, and the resurrection of the body. So Christianity has been, and Western Christianity has condensed into this shriveled spirituality, and Catholicism was the main carrier of that, but then not the Eastern churches, but the Western church, and then the Protestantism radicalized it still further, and we lost contact with reality, really. So science has been liberating, and now with quantum physics, it's an entirely different ballgame. And the best book, I think, now is Fritjof Capra, who's trained at Heisenberg and all the great modern physicists, Austrian, and Pierluigi Luisi, who's a biochemist in Italy, a prize-winning biochemist. The book is the Systems View of Life. I think that's the title of it, something like that. You can Google it or look at it on Amazon. And it chronicles the evolution of science and the new openings, and he suggests that it really is very open to the spiritual dimension there. And particularly the biology, not physics, becomes the foundation of science, and particularly cognitive science within biology. And from Chile, the school of the Santiago School of Cognition by Maduro and Varela which all matter has a cognitive dimension. They see as foundation. And, okay, then in terms of the farm, but in the United States that's true, but France has worked very hard to retain its family farms, and so is Italy. Italy has lots of co-ops and family farms that are more efficient and more productive than agribusiness. UN studies have shown that small family farms are far more productive of food, good food as well, than agribusiness. What agribusiness is productive of is capital. But it destroys the earth and it produces bad food and not that much of it. The Green Revolution is a catastrophe on the planet. India, people are starving to death now in India because of the Green Revolution. And Vandana Shiva, who's a PhD in physics, has written extensively about that. And the UN has published studies that the small family farm, ecological farm, is the most efficient. My cousin, who has the same name I do in Ireland, and a family farm has been there, who knows, thousands of years. He said, my father had 6 cows and now I have 100, and I'm in debt because I have all this machinery and all this pesticides and all the fertilizers and stuff, and I have trouble sending money. He sent all his kids to the university, and it wasn't a problem, and I have trouble paying for my kids to go to the university. The remaining farmers are now committing suicide. It was a wave at first in the Great Plains of Canada, now they're committing suicide across the Great Plains in the United States as well. vast numbers, far above anybody else, even at great events. Trump, why? Well, neoliberalism, which our friends, the Clintons and so on, and Jimmy Carter and everybody was promoting, they sucked the economic guts, the industrial guts right out of the country and sold it to China. And Wall Street made a lot of money. And fortunately, Jimmy Carter went back to being good, but the Clintons, they just went on to make money, you know. It was terrible, and people were rightfully, but all the people who were associated in the great sort of what we call world-class cities, they're all linked into that money-making machine of neoliberal capitalism, and they all do well, although they have a hard time because their houses are inflated and cost so much. The house we bought in Washington, D.C. years ago for $121,000 now goes for $2 million, and so you need to make a lot of money just to pay the mortgage, you know. It's absurd. They rebelled, understandably. They're rebelling all across the Western world. This modern industrial civilization is really screwing our people, certainly economically, but also socially and spiritually. They're seeing their families falling apart. They're seeing plagues of drugs, and religion is disappearing. I'm just reading a book about Islam, and the way Islam looks about the secular West is unbelievable. They think it's degenerate, and I think they're correct in that. And the minority, only about 5% of the Islamists, the radical terrorists, feed off that, and they gain support from other people. So Trump, I understand why Trump won. I predicted he would win. My wife wouldn't believe it, but she says, "Well, I got it." But the solution is not to go back to the other. The Democratic Party is a disaster. So we need a new vision of our new civilization. Nothing short of that. Nothing short. And there are people across the planet planting seeds for that beginning to grow, extensive networks of the ecology movement. But as I say, it keeps being overwhelmed by the universities, which are pumping out new people faster than you could begin to convert the existing people out there. Where do we go? That is the great question. And there's all kinds of scenarios. One is that we could gradually transform. Another, the other extreme scenario would be that it would collapse. I believe it will collapse myself. I don't think there's any way to sustain modern industrial civilization. And that we are, and the United Nations is predicting we're facing tens, maybe hundreds of millions of eco-refugees from sea level rise. I mean, we lived right on the shore of Miami, and the docks that were built when our condo was built were going underwater already. Most of Florida will be underwater, probably. All the data that we have is old. The newer data is showing sea level rise is accelerating very rapidly. The wildfires, the drought. Many of the wars they're saying are particularly in Africa, are being precipitated by drought. I think we're looking, civilizations do collapse. The Roman Empire did collapse. And it was monasticism that rebuilt it, but not the Benedictines. It was the Irish Celtic monks and the Celtic monks from across the British Isles who were organized around them, who rebuilt it and gathered people together. So one thing we should be doing now is beginning to create what I call lighthouses. This is what this eco-monastic movement would be. The model, we have all the technology to live in a completely ecological way of life. It's already there. But we would model it in a visible way. And then at the same time, that could help other people. And every time we build a new housing development, there's no reason why it couldn't be an eco-village instead of a mass tract housing. And actually, it would be better for people and probably would cost less. But the other possibility is it will collapse. And these eco-villages then would be sources of regeneration and rebuilding. The one I appeal to is Peter Morin of the Catholic Worker. And unfortunately, the Catholic Worker movement, I think, never fully understood Peter Morin. Certainly the wonderful Dorothy Day did, her own daughter said that. And Peter trained Tamar and did her little playmate, Mabel Gill, and he trained them in his vision as young girls. And Mabel Gill is a dear friend, and she coached me a lot about Peter's vision. And I won't get into it, but that's what he called for, a new monasticism modeled on the Celtic model, which would create not farms, not individual farms, but villages. Because he used the word commune, but in French, commune means a village or a town. We speak of the Paris commune. And we're just just had a conference in Assisi, and Assisi is the Comune di Assisi, it's a commune. And so he creating agroecological villages, that's what he was talking about. And then at the same time, you would need to deal with all the casualties that are happening in our urban areas, and that's what the hospitality before that Dorothy Day really excelled at, deserves to be seen for. But fundamentally, the first thing people, is a good French-trained clarification of thought. And he said that would require creating a new kind of agronomic university, a different kind of university. So creating an alternative university model, I think, is one big step. Creating an ecological village model is another step. And then doing what Peter thought could also be done in the city, which is not just housing the homeless, but creating co-ops, all kinds of food, housing, constructing dwellings, and it's a major project in Canada, in Christian Ontario, based on Peter Morin's model. It's truly flourishing. So that, I hope that's something of an answer.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
I think we owe Joe another round of applause for that wonderful response. I'm really intrigued most about learning more from Joe and maybe conversations that happen the rest of the day about the Celtic monastic model. Maybe it's my own Irish roots and the fact that my great-grandfather was from Galway and Ballinsloe himself. And it's something I'm really intrigued to learn more about. But at this time, it's 9:30, and to stay on time with our next session of 3 presenters, I want to call this keynote to a close and invite everyone to go out and enjoy some coffee and continue the conversation for only a few minutes. Let's please be respectful of our next 3 presenters, and we'll begin shortly. So, thank you very much. Wow, Joe.